Are you ready to take your first steps towards financial freedom by investing in property? Whether you're a first-time investor or you've started your portfolio but need some help continuing to grow, 2022 REB Buyers Agent of the Year and Rising Star finalist Lachlan Vidler and his team at Atlas Property Group are here to help. As experts in property investment, Lachlan and his team are ready to help you take your next step in growing your portfolio. By completing the research, sourcing and negotiations, Lachlan goes the extra mile to find you a high-performing investment property. Visit atlaspropertygroup.com.au to book in your discovery call absolutely free of charge.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
G'day, how you going? Phil Tarrant. You probably know the voice by now. Nasally, boring, lacking intrigue. Host of the Smart Property Investment Show. My guest is giggling in the sideline. He's a regular on this thing, so he sort of gets myself giving me a bit of a hard time. Very fortunate position I'm in here at Smart Property Investment. I've been doing this now for 5 years. This podcast, chatting with people right across the spectrum of property in Australia, demographers, economists, buyers agents, accountants, lawyers, conveyancers, property investors, importantly, curating, hosting, chatting through what's going on. And it's been a real privilege of mine to be able to navigate this over many years and help sort of with the collective knowledge around property investment. Things have moved on. I remember when I kicked off investing in property, people used to go to property investment expos, which I think still happens. And if you're going to one, let me know. I'd like to know what they're like these days. But the way people get their info these days is very different. And podcasting, in particular, Smart Property Investment Show, is going out to well over 100,000 people every single month. And I've got to pinch myself sometimes just to get some sense for the size, scope and scale of this now, and the fact that people are tuning into this to try and learn from others, and absolutely peer-to-peer learning to do what they do better right now. And I'm getting a lot of just phone calls from people I know, but also we're seeing it coming through smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. We're smack bang in the middle of this weather event. If you're in Australia, you must know about this. You pick up any paper right now, it's going to tell you three things. Number one, there's an election coming up, and this is what's going on. It's a bit schoolyard at the moment, but I think they're now starting to work out what their policies are. So we have the budget coming up the end of this month with the election to be held in May at some point. So the first thing you're going to see. Second thing is you're going to see what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. War in Europe, who would have thought, very similar, 100 years on from the Great War, outside the scope of this podcast, but there's ramifications for financial markets that you should be aware of. And the other thing is that you're going to see in the papers right now is the floods, which are really impacting the east coast of New South Wales. And it's largely very much a coastal issue this time around. And these aren't like floods which are happening further inland and sort of impacting the coast. It is a coastal thing. We've got this weather event underway right now, and it's been hitting the east coast of New South Wales, anywhere essentially from Brisbane down to Shellhaven, Illawarra type areas, the main area. So Sydney, Wollongong, the Central Coast, Newcastle, up through the northern areas of New South Wales, in particular Lismore, which are all across and up into Brizzy. Big floods, big issue. And here we are again, same situation we were in Sydney at least a couple of years ago. And I think back to the hallmarks of those massive floods in Brizzy back in 2014, I think by memory they were on. So this is hitting us hard right now. And there is obviously a human cost to us all. We've had a number of deaths, and it's horrible to hear those things. And our thoughts go to those families who are impacted at that level, but all those people, small businesses, impacted by the floods. But the big question is, being a podcast around property investment, what does all this mean for property investors? Like, again, it's a sage reminder that you got to be careful where you invest. And when you see these floods happen, and one of the 1,000-year weather events is what they're calling it right now, there's people in Lismore, for example, God, that's a huge impact there. What does all this mean? What is the impact of these East Coast flooding on property prices? Outside of my skill set, I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't know the specifics. Got in the studio with me Paul Glossop, CEO of Pure Property Investment. He's just about to release some information around this to all those people that subscribe into his newsletter on Pure Property Investment. You can go and do that. Just go to purepropertyinvestment.com, specifically looking at the impact of East Coast flooding. So I've got him on the show beforehand. I wanted to get the inside word before he releases out to everyone else so you can be more informed and try and get some sense and interpretation to this. Paul, are you staying dry?
Mate, barely. I actually had a site meeting on a development site this morning and went in with thongs in hand and no rain jacket and came out thoroughly drenched, and then had to go to a company meeting with my team and went straight home and got changed because it is absolutely bucketing down at the moment.
Belting down. And I thought this weather event was behind us last week, not this week, but we're getting another huge deluge today. And for what I understand, tomorrow as well. So there was a little bit of reprieve over the weekend, but I think all those rivers are now getting topped up. Particularly, I've been chatting to people on the Central Coast, getting hammered up there right now. So this isn't going away at any point soon. So this is the immediate impact and how we respond to it. And a lot of that is done by the great work from our volunteers and the SES and even the Army sort of pitching in, doing some great work, helping with immediate impact. And that's rescuing people where required, making things safe, the human element of sorting this out, making sure that people are in evacuation centres. But from that, it runs into a whole nother gamut of work, trying to repair damage, rethink and reconsider how we approach this into the future. You would be aware of the bridge out at Windsor that should have only flooded once every 3 years, flooded twice in 1 year, I think now. So, this is all going on. But this piece that you're about to, where you've penned that you're about to sort of produce and distribute out to property investors, what's the headline for us, mate? Give us what we need to know now rather than having to wait around for it.
Well, the reality is, Phil, and you and I are both people who are sitting smack bang in the what does this mean for me? What does this mean for property that I may own? The reality is that there's, as you already mentioned, mate, I mean, we can't overestimate essentially what is happening in these markets. And I personally have a pretty large development site underway in Lismore in particular, which thankfully is not in a flood-prone area, but I've got one of my best friends and one of my best men at my wedding lives just on the outskirts of Lismore and some acreage out there. And I spoke to him literally yesterday morning, and he was just coming home from helping one of his best buddies clear out his home, essentially of everything that is his lifelong belongings, with 2 children, a wife, animals, the works, literally everything's gone. So they spent a whole day trying to peel back, and you can't just leave it. You can't demolish it because there's literally putrid, rotting carcasses of animals, of livestock, of stuff that's coming out of homes, and really unfathomable scenes. And he was quite emotional about it all because although it didn't impact his home, he had friends who effectively lost a lot. And the position that we now look at from we take a standpoint of, well, we're in the property investment space and we're buying assets which are ideally over the long term going to create wealth. A lot of people are highly leveraged into a lot of these markets. And when you just mentioned at the start of this podcast, we're talking well over 1,000-kilometre coastline, a stretch of coastline that's been impacted by this. And there is so many homes and so many people thinking, well, what happens now? So what we're going to be doing and what we're going to be releasing is a bit more of probably a little bit of a retrospective look to say, unfortunately, this isn't the first time these events have happened. In certain areas, this is the most extreme that it's been recorded. And obviously, a lot of that means we're going to have to rewrite some of the record books for flood levels, et cetera. But our job here is basically now looking to say, well, what does this actually mean for property prices and what's going to be the impact both on growth, on where supply now is going to be in the future, what happens for vacancy rates, what happens to these people who have been displaced. Look at markets such as the Northern Rivers. You've got a couple of 100,000 people in general out there, and I think about close to about 2 or 3% of those are displaced from these floods. And when you're talking about those numbers, you're talking about literally thousands and thousands of people who don't have a home to live in. So there's emergency accommodation at the moment, and then you've got to say, well, what's the flow-on effect and what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future? Because typically that's what's going to dictate it. So that's what we're looking at, mate. And unfortunately, there is some pretty recent events which will give us some pretty key insights as to what's happened in the past will likely happen again in the future. So, mate, we've got some data now on what happened in the 2011 floods. Also, basically, if you take a look back a bit further in the Southeast Queensland market, back to probably more extreme 74 floods, probably a little bit too far back then to talk about what happens in the property market. But in particular, Southeast Queensland, looking at the ramification of the 2011 floods and what happened in the property market there, it's interesting. And there is some key insights as to what we expect will happen over the next few years from this.
So was it 2011 floods or 2014 floods in Brizzy? Did I get that wrong?
2011, yeah.
2011,
yeah.
And that's when we remember those pictures of those sort of walkways sort of sailing down the river there, hitting bridges and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah,
and
correct.
I think I might know the guy that you're talking about up there in the Northern Rivers area. And I'll just acknowledge the fact that this is a property investment podcast, and I don't want it to sound cold that we're talking about how you benefit from investing in areas which may be flood prone. I just want to disconnect and acknowledge that the human suffering and element which is taking place right now. Both
100%.
Myself and Paul, we know a lot of people who are impacted. So our thoughts are with you. But let's talk about property investment, Paul. Well, let's talk about weather. This is the East Coast. Is this El Nino or is this just
La Nina?
La Nina, or is it consecutive East Coast lows? And I know you are, and I saw it come into my feed. I'm sick of seeing it. The Surfer's Guide to Property Investment, which you penned, I don't know, a couple of years ago.
Following a lot of weather patterns.
But I know surfers like East Coast lows because once it comes through and it's a bit wobbly, but then normally you might get some westerly winds, at least on the East Coast, coming off the back of it. It cleans it all up, and you normally get pretty big swell, right, during East Coast lows.
And then
good for surfers. Good for surfers, probably not so good for people who own property, investment properties, particularly in flood-affected areas. And you probably see the photos whenever these East Coast lows come in, all the breaks inside the harbour light up, right? Nielsen Park, Balmoral, there was a wave the other day.
Yep.
Give me some science around the weather of East Coast lows, because I tell you what, if you're beachfront, if you're like Wamberal or Collaroy or up north entrance and stuff, like when you see these storm surges coming in,
nervous.
You start taking hundreds of thousands of dollars off your property price.
Yeah, or added on to build some new retaining walls and everything that goes with it. So, look, the reality of the basic stuff that we have to be aware of on the east coast of Australia is the fact that you typically have your two main weather patterns that happen. And this time of year is the warmer months. From time to time, depending on the year, you're going to get the larger northerly and northeast and easterly weather events, which bring in a lot more of that warmer currents as well as that warmer weather and the storms that come from out in the Pacific. So that's usually what you're getting this time of year. Is the reality is that you're probably going to see different components there, which are going to take you from probably not necessarily the winds that come from these types of weather events, but it's more the rain, because you're getting a lot more of that warmer air, which dumps a whole bunch of the moisture, and you get the cyclone events, which they're pretty common, especially Southeast Queensland. They're relatively common. Every cyclone season this happens. So people are prepared for that. I think what we're seeing now is a bit more of a combination of that deluge of these events aren't necessarily coming a long way and then coming from offshore, going onshore and dumping a bit of weather and bringing a bit of swell, and it happens for 1 or 2 days. This has been back-to-back consecutive weather events, which obviously that's where the issue is. The winter time brings more of your colder southerly winds, and that typically impacts you from down the Mornington Peninsula all the way up to probably midway through the New South Wales coastline, and that can bring you storm surges that impact property that time of year differently as well, and that does bring a lot more winds typically and a lot more rain from those bottom ends up, and can bring different inland rain events sort of more down towards Eden and the coastline there as well. But, regardless, I guess, what we get back down to the impact of this and what people need to be fully aware of is two things here. I think one of which is that we'll dive into the property data and what's going to happen and what we expect to happen shortly. But I think the other thing that this will always and does always highlight is, unfortunately, as humans, we have relatively short memories, and we like fair weather and we like status quo a lot of the time. And until you get an event like this, it dials off the radar what you need to look for when you're buying property. And whether that's looking for easements, whether it's looking for bushfire overlays, which we're only talking 2 years ago, we had the worst bushfires that we've ever seen in this country's history decimate a whole range of areas. But you can actually look at bushfire overlays when buying property, so if your property is going to be impacted by the potential for bushfires, and also obviously flood overlays. Now, these are things you can actually search for, and you should, when you're buying property, be aware, because if you're not aware, the impact of it can be not necessarily, I don't want to be too doomsday and say it's catastrophic, but it has an impact. It has an impact on the value of your property. It has impact essentially on, can your property be insured? And if so, how much is that insurance going to cost? And what can you actually insure versus what you can't insure? And it has an impact on demand. And that demand's both for tenants who want to rent your property and people who are going to want to buy that property in the future. And probably also in that same token, how the council is going to deem the usability or utility of your land for future development, because all of a sudden you could be having a property that might be a 2-acre block of land that you think is prime for development. All of a sudden, you've got this huge flood overlay that sits there, and you're like, well, hang on. Council's never going to want to see my property subdivided into smaller lots and essentially create a whole bunch of flood-prone properties. So the impact of extreme weather events, it has always been and will always be very important for you to know as an investor. And if you're not aware of it, that's our job as property investment buyers agents, is to go that extra level to understand that detail and essentially say, well, yeah, that property, and this is something that will come out of this, guaranteed, is that you'll see properties that look like fire sales, no pun intended, in the sense that they will show really good value and top line to say, well, hang on, this property is one street back from that property and this one's literally 20% cheaper. That's a bargain. Well, don't be too assured of yourself that because one thing is cheaper than another, that means that's good buying. Do your due diligence, and this is going to bring that home very, very heavily.
And what you're talking about there is the inherent value in an asset. And when you get events like this, and you might be aware of it might be being in a 100-year flood, well, they're talking about this 1,000-year weather event, right? Like something that's never flooded before, property's flooded. So what does that mean for the inherent value of your land? Now, if you're not looking to sell it immediately, it doesn't really matter that much, who knows? But if you need to transition that property for whatever reason, you're going to be impacted by it, whether it's just a straight out sale, whether you bought something for the purpose of development and now it's now possible. So this is the inherent value. You've got to do your homework. And I want to be chicken little on this, like you mentioned, like a doomsday merchant, but you've got to be conscious and aware of this, particularly as a property investor. You're buying for the purpose of the utility of that asset. Now, utility is normally some sort of financial outcome, capital growth, cash flow, or both, right? So you're not investing just because you like the look of a joint. This is the big issue. And we spoke a little bit about the weather. We're not trained weather people, meteorologists. Maybe we get someone in at some point. Might do that, have a chat about how weather sort of impacts property investment. And the other point would be, the implications of that. You've got this whole question around climate change outside of the scope of this particular podcast, but there is some sort of intersection between climate change and the inherent value of property. You're going to need to look at some of these coastal properties, which, a lot of people think the dream is owning a house on the beach. Guess what? That might not be feasible in 50 years' time. So, you've got to see how you approach these things moving forward. I might get a climate change guy on as well. But for the specifics of this is about the impact of East Coast flooding, Paul. I want to get into the data. We'll just go to a break. Stay with us. Back in a moment. Welcome back, everyone. It's Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm with Paul Glossop. He is the director, founder of Pure Property Investment. We're chatting through the impact of East Coast flooding. We're smack bang in the middle, and now it's belting rain as we speak. So this is on the ground live as it happens. Paul, what happened in Lismore? Let's use that as a case study. Lismore's prone for flooding. That whole sort of Northern Rivers region has these big waterways, which in many ways are the lifeblood of the local economies up there, agriculture, etc.
Yep.
So they're not going anywhere. They're staying around. And a lot of these towns grew organically around these rivers, Lismore being one of them. I think of places like Casino. I think of places, in and around there. There's many different of these towns. It's their heartbeat, the rivers, but it's also their master. And when we see what happens in Lismore, things change absolutely overnight. There's been a number of different floods in Lismore. Why is this so different? Why do you think we need to look at the property data and the flood data this time around more so than before?
Look, I definitely don't think it's sort of, this is probably the one time where people need to take notice. I think the benefit of any investor in this day and age is that you should be able to get your hands on this data versus previous years of having to go and scour through council chamber data and figure out where the overlays are and get out cadastre maps and all the rest of it. It's just simply far too easy and far too practical now for people to not use that as an excuse to say, I didn't know, I wasn't aware. So everyone should be aware. And if you're not, make yourself aware. I think that's the reality, because if you're aware, you make your risks and make your decisions on the risk and essentially, So for me, it's just empowering yourself. But if I look at, this is where we get down to the facts of it. Is as much as this current extreme weather event right up and down the East Coast is unquestionably going to impact people, it's going to impact towns, and it's going to have in some cases a very lasting impact. The reality is that it still is going to mean that the markets will be a dynamic of their own. And unfortunately, a lot of these areas will actually see an increase in demand for flood-free and tenant-ready and move-in ready houses over the next 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 months. And we're in such a unique scenario this time around because we're obviously coming out of a pandemic, which has had a huge flow-on effect to labour and materials and the building industry, which now all of a sudden you're talking tens of thousands of properties which are neither going to be rehabilitated and or renovated and or potentially fully rebuilt over the immediate term future. So we've already got 30% increase on property renovation for materials and labour. That's not going to change. So we're going to see this issue there where for someone to go and say, great, well, I'm just going to move to another area. I think for me, and I actually was the mayor of Lismore, as an example, Stephen Craig, was on Channel 10 News last night, which I saw very quickly him speak, which he raised a very, very good point to this, which essentially outlined the fact that Lismore, to your point earlier, Phil, is that it's not news for them. They flood. It's built on a floodplain. And to that point, floodplains are actually really important for agricultural purposes as well, because they obviously breed life, and you've got prime land that comes from that. When they spill over, you've got your silt, you've got rich soils, all the rest of it. The reality is Lismore's town centre is built smack bang in the floodplain. And this is obviously a much more extreme flood than what they've ever had on record. But their last previous real major flood was 2017. And his point with that is that go back 2 weeks and you try to find an empty retail store to lease on the main town strip of Lismore. There was zero. There was zero vacancy in that town centre. From a previous flood that happened 5 years ago, they rebuilt. Their economy is and was booming. They've got unprecedented demand for people living there, for all the resources and everything else that comes with living in a bustling regional town. And Lismore's a great town, neighbouring a whole bunch of great areas, and it's got a lot going on for it economically. That will happen again. The reality is it's going to be tough. There's going to be a shortage of supply. There's going to be people who are going to be have to figure out where to live for a short period of time. But the actual dynamic of that town is that there's actually going to be less supply. So you're going to have more demand in that area. You may have, though, from the outcome of that, potentially a displacement of where people are going to have to rebuild if they do have to rebuild. But one real interesting point is that the actual news cross last night, he was in his council chambers, and that actual mayor lost his home in this flood as well. So he wasn't exactly sitting high and dry, but he was in his council chambers, which sit on the top of the hill in Lismore, which were built, ironically, 40 years ago after the previous flood that came through there about 45 years ago. So they built up on the hill with the intention to say, hey, we want to try and incentivize everyone to move up to the top of the hill because down the bottom is flood prone. Now, those council chambers sit essentially isolated 10 kilometres from the town centre because everyone said, no, bugger that. We are aware of it, but we're happy because this town centre is the lifeblood of this town. It has a lot more of the generational positioning of where everyone wants to be, what they have, and the whole old school effect of what Lismore town. And there's a number of towns throughout the Northern Rivers that are exactly like that, not dissimilar to the entire Brisbane market, from Ipswich right down to the northern Brisbane markets right through the centre of Brisbane. You've got these floodplains, but you've got these areas which have been there for a couple of hundred years, which people are they're too entrenched there. So the reality is that the normal dynamic will play out. There's going to be a lack of supply over the next 6, 12, 18 months, which, if anything, unfortunately for those who are living there, is going to exacerbate rents, and it's going to exacerbate house prices because you have more demand on less property, and that property to rebuild is actually going to be more expensive. So I think the dynamic, unfortunately, is going to play out that will ironically make many of these markets probably slightly more expensive, if not a little bit to moderately more expensive over the next 1, 2, and 3 years.
Yeah, it's a good wrap up of that. And to your point around, and this is going to be, a unique case study in Australia because of those factors that you mentioned. Whether or not you'll reposition the town, whether or not you'll get people to think about things differently and therefore rebuild at different locations which aren't flood zones, I don't know. That's a question for the local council and the mayor there, and no doubt they're working through this stuff right now. But the huge overlay of that is that this can't be common Australia. Let's all get together. And Lismore seems to be this sort of epicenter of everyone's focal point on the impact of these flood. And if you haven't seen photos of it, go and Google it. Absolute madness. Water levels up to the top of first-story buildings. And once the water resides, have a look at the damage it does. It's mind-blowing. But even if Australia all locked forces and said, quick, Australia, let's help out Lismore, and there was unlimited amount of money to throw at it, you're not going to be able to rebuild that town quickly because there isn't the stuff to rebuild it. And this is the big issue with Lismore, and this is the big issue with all flood-affected areas now. I reckon if you think back to the catastrophic events in Darwin in 1974 with Cyclone Tracy, it took decades for that town to rebuild. A lot of it was remoteness. A lot of it was lack of labor, trying to get people up there to help rebuild. A lot of it was lack of resources up there as well. I think you might see that playing out. I think it's going to take a long time, Paul, for Lismore to bounce back, purely because the intent might be there, the money might be there, the right attitude might be there, but the material ain't there. And mate, try and get a tradie in Lismore at the best of time.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to have to do something really, really smart at a state or federal level to mobilize getting the right people and material to Lismore to make that happen. I don't know. It's got to be a really interesting case study. And what that does to property prices, you're probably right. It's probably going to put upwards pressure.
Yeah. Well,
rents.
I mean, I think on rents and on established property in flood-free areas, because people are going to be aware of it. People are going to look. But if you look at what the data is, and I go back to that sort of that 2017 flood that went through the Northern Rivers area, impacted Lismore, Gunnellabar, and a couple of those other surrounding areas, is that Lismore's grown by about 60% in value in the last 3 years alone. You've seen rents grow by almost 25%. This is all pre this stuff happening, and you've got still a very affordable market. You know, Lismore generally is 45 minutes from Byron Bay. You're 45 minutes from Ballina Airport. You're an hour and a bit from the Gold Coast Tweed area, and it's got its own, you know, large hospital, university, and a whole range of things connected by the M1 that takes you essentially up and down the entire East Coast. It's a great pocket and a very good, I guess, example of what a solid regional city should and can perform like. And it's not going to change. People are going to want to be there. It's a bustling general area. You're talking about a population of 40, 50,000 people in the broader Lismore greater catchment area. So you've got a large amount of people. The data will always suggest that, yeah, you'll have this immediate impact. And there was, I think if you last checked maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, on the actual portals, there was about 40 houses for sale in Lismore. The reality is at least half of those are actually uninhabitable now. So now you've got less than half of the available properties for sale in Lismore are actually for sale anymore. So then you look at literally immediate impact, and then you say, okay, well, what's going to change over the next 6 months? Well, not much. And you've got about 2,000 or 3,000 people who are displaced. Where are they going to go? So there's a combination, like you said. I think state, local, federal governments are probably going to have to come to the table here to figure out how they're going to support not just, and we talk about Lismore as an example, but you go up to Brisbane, you've got a lot more properties that have been impacted than the Northern Rivers. And again, this was only 10 years ago, a more extreme event happened 10 years ago, but of a relatively similar scale. And you've got to figure out now, how are we going to get all of these tradies and people into those markets? One thing there will be, ironically, is there's going to be a lot more demand for labour. There's going to be a lot more demand for jobs, and that ain't going to stop anytime soon.
I reckon what they should do is be flying, now that the borders are opened up, they should be flying in plane loads of skilled tradespeople into Ballina Airport and say, welcome to Australia. Here's your citizenship paper. Here's a job.
Here's a job. And essentially figure out, if there's temporary, they've figured out a way to do it in the mining sectors when we had mining booms, to put the Humpties essentially everywhere they possibly could, demountables. Go and load up some larger areas which have got connection. It might take a number of months to get that set up, but I don't doubt that there's an opportunity to that point, Phil, is that if you're going to open up the floodgates, let's get the workers where they need it. Open up Europe to come and say, hey, guys, there is more jobs here than we know what to do. I think
probably 1,000 Irish tradies there in the
100%
in Dublin there, itching to get out to Australia. So
straight into there's the opportunity there.
Maybe we're doing a wrong job, Paul. Maybe we should be creating policy in Canberra rather than
talking too much sense, mate. Not enough
gibbering on about property. But it is a case study. This Lismore thing's a case study. But I think it's probably serendipitous that we can talk about Lismore because of its huge impact, but also I know you're developing there at the moment, so no doubt they're going to talk the place up, right? Because you're probably going to be selling some properties there at a point in time.
Well, ironically, we're doing development there. We don't intend to sell any property, but we might have to change that mindset because there might be a need. I literally, as of only yesterday, we were sort of scouring, trying to figure. We still haven't been able to set our eyes on this development site that we got there, which is 2 hectares. It's not a small block of land, but the reality is that there's no dwelling, unfortunately, on that property. But a lot of the talk right now, which I take a sideward step from the property space as well, is that there's a lot of Australians who are putting their hand in their pocket or donating things that are needed for those areas. But the challenge everyone's got now, apparently, is that there is nowhere to store this stuff because we've got a hot climate, we've got weather and all kinds of things, a lot of perishable stuff. So they need storage facilities to store a lot of this stuff as well. So I was actually considering, are we able to make our block of land available for just storage containers to go sit on there for the next 6 months and just put people's belongings. But there's all kinds of opportunity up there. But yeah, I think the biggest thing that's going to be obvious is throughout the Northern Rivers and up to Southeast Queensland is that if you want a job in that trade sector, it's going to be nigh on impossible for you not to find one, I think, for at least a couple of years, which ultimately is going to bode very, very well for the
that's great for local
economy.
economies, right? Because that there alone will attract a lot of people to the area, whether or not they'll stay, who knows? But that transient workforce, they like to spend a few bucks, right? So that will really help the local economy get on its feet. And I think about all the SMEs there in Lismore, and again, Lismore being a case study, getting people in there, this micro economy that will be developed around the refurbishment, the repair of Lismore will create, in some ways, a bit of a boom when it comes to the local economy. And that's good. And you heard it there. No doubt the mayor of Lismore listens to this podcast. Paul's he's got 2 hectares up on the hill somewhere. You can store your stuff on there if you want.
Yeah, look, absolutely. We're not going to be building on it for at least 6 to 9 months. There'll be a few roads.
All he wants in return is a speedy development application.
It's a speedy DA approval.
We joke. But
one hand washes another.
But let's have a chat about this quickly, because you're talking about these areas rebounding quickly. We spoke about some of those things. But I want to get into the inherent drivers of places like Lismore. We'll just go to a break. Stay with us. Back in a moment. Welcome back. Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show with Paul Glossop from Pure Property Investment. Now, we're speaking about Lismore as a case study example of impact of flooding on the East Coast. And your thesis, Paul, is that it's been happening for a couple of hundred years. It's going to continue ad infinitum because you can't control nature. It's what we do about it. Your position is that they'll just return to where they are. They'll just improve, rebuild. That will drive things forward. What is it? What is it around? Or what is it about these areas like your Lismore and these other Northern Rivers, or any other regional town with very similar fundamentals to them? Local economies, diversified economies, population movements. Why are places like Lismore so attractive? Why did you spend your money there? You must think things are going to happen that are good in places like that for you to put your pony up your dough in terms of development.
Yeah, and I mentioned not too far back in the podcast, they've seen 60% growth in 3 years in that market. That's rapid growth, and we've seen really strong rental growth in that market as well. And to be fair, that's not going to change. If anything, I think that's going to be exacerbated by these events, unfortunately, for a lot of people have been displaced. But to the question as to why those markets, or why that market in particular versus potentially major town centres, is combination of what's happened out of the last couple of years with COVID. There's been a fair bit of that, I guess, self-reflection from a lot of individuals and families to think, okay, well, where could we be if we didn't need to be here, if we could raise our family and we could have our jobs? I know that's sort of, the jury's still somewhat out on, is it going to be a permanent remote workforce? So then the question comes, well, if I'm not going to be fully remote, how can I be in a position where I can latch on to opportunities as far as jump on a plane, or have good connectivity, good healthcare, good schools, opportunity for university? Those major things, which, Phil, I know you look at, and anyone you've had on your show as far as the direct investors, whether they're other buyers agents, whether they're demographers, we are needing to be surrounded by as many of those things as we possibly can at the most affordable rate that we can possibly get it at. So for me, a market such as Lismore, as I mentioned earlier, it's a classic market that's within a short drive to a large airport, which has access to every single major East Coast major city airport in the country. You have a hospital which has access for a lot of different opportunities there. You have a large university, which then again has a lot of intake and enrollment opportunities. You've got multiple high schools, multiple primary schools, access to coastline, Byron Bay, those types of areas. This is an area which is within an hour of everything and anything, but essentially sells properties which were transacting a year ago at about $500,000, $700,000, probably more like $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 now for a nice house on a decent block of land. As an investor, you could still attract probably somewhere between a 4, maybe a 4.5%, 5% yield on those numbers as well. So the numbers in general versus what you get for your money was very, very, and is very, very attractive. That's what draws us to those types of areas. And there's quite a large number of them, as you know, Phil, right up and down the East Coast, over towards the Adelaide market, over towards the WA market. There is always these really quite attractive regional areas, which they have the connectivity, they have the culture, they have the access, and they have the lifestyle, but they also combine that with affordability. And they're the markets that we're always trying to look for.
Okay, good summary. So, Paul, I look forward to this piece that you're penning coming out the next day or so. Go and subscribe to your newsletter, no doubt, on pureproperinvestment.com. Now, Paul, while I got you, and I'll conclude with this, mate, what's happening nationwide? We've been told to expect price drops by the major economists. Do you subscribe to that?
I think it's similar to your rhetoric on will interest rates go up. I think at some stage, property prices will go down at a point in time. Now, where that is and what that is will be a very, very specific outcome to an area. And I think this is where we're going back to a normal market. This year will be the return to normality for Australian property market. And that in turn means that we're going to have boom markets, bust markets, and majority of them will be sideways markets. Will we see a rapid drop in any particular market? From the data that we see, no, not at all. The reality is that since this discussion started probably a year ago about interest rate hikes and how that's going to impact the economy, and more specifically the last 2, 3, 4 months, in that time, what have we had in Australia? We've had essentially a whole raft of different changes that have happened. From, I guess, an economic standpoint, more specifically, we've had a breakout of the European war, which has added huge instability to the global markets. We've now got a natural disaster, which I think is going to impact a lot more than what they thought the bottom line would. And when it comes down to it, I think the RBA is going to look at this a lot more intently now to say, well, their main factor was going to be underlying wage growth, was going to be what they wanted to see before they started to impact prices on money. And for us, that's really what I think is going to change the market prices in any area. In particular, places like Sydney, places like Melbourne, places like Hobart are probably your 3 main markets that are trading at about anywhere between 10 and 15 times average household incomes versus mortgage commitment rates. But you compare that to markets such as Brisbane, markets such as Adelaide, markets such as Perth, which are trading between 5 and up to probably 8 times average household income versus mortgage commitment rates. You've got a bunch of different speeds going on in Australian property markets, which in turn means that how sensitive they are to the change of prices of money will dictate the outcome. So in short, I think we're going to have a 2-speed Australian property market for some time to come, because there is huge amounts of affordability in some areas, and some places, in particular those markets that I mentioned, are probably closer to the top end. But will they see a rapid drop? Highly doubtful.
And to what you've framed there, you're going to have winners and losers when it comes to property investors in those markets. You see it all the time in these 2-speed markets. Just means you just can't, which is what it's been through the back end of 2020, 2021, get a dart, throw it at a map of Australia, and pretty much wherever it landed, you're going to make some bucks on property. What you're going to end up, there's going to be areas in Australia that still do that, and there's going to be areas in Australia that don't do that. So the smart investors, and I'd like to think people tuning into this are those smart investors. It is the Smart Property Investment Show, are those who are going to be the winners. Don't be one of the losers. And there's lots of ways to mitigate and minimize risk when it comes to investing in property in these type of markets. If anything, when you get markets which are transitioning as they are right now to what is deemed to be a normal market, is where you really see opportunities for the smart investor. So what would be the one thing, Paul, you'd be doing to capitalize on that, other than speaking to a buyer's agent, no doubt?
I'd be getting my money in order, to be completely frank with you. I think if you're a property investor or someone who's in property right now has already got exposure to the market, chances are whatever you own has probably got a fair bit of equity sitting in it. So if you're not getting smart by going down the path of thinking, how do I extract that money out, i.e. in a line of credit or an overdraft, or freeing up that money, and then also getting myself prepared, for me, that's what people should be doing, other than obviously talking about specifics of where and what to buy. Getting your finances in order now
absolutely
is
money first,
super key.
Money first, and I'm doing that right now, and I'll do an update soon. I know you probably listened to it, Paul, on the Smart Property Investment portfolio, which we've been mapping for a decade now, buying it, transacting and managing that portfolio. We're going through a big refinance at the moment. Like a lot of people, we're seeing pretty good growth in our portfolio, so we're going to look to leverage that, extract some equity, and get ready for the next round of buying, which will be different sort of properties than what we've bought beforehand. We're sort of further down our pathway now with a sort of maturing portfolio. So I've got the team over at Finny Mortgages, finny.com.au, looking after that for me. So I've had a chat to one of them. They're going to come on the show with me and talk you all through exactly how we're going about that refinancing. We're going to reset some 5-year interest-only stuff. We're not going to refinance everything up to its max. We want to keep the LVR to a pretty reasonable position, but there's some properties in there with quite a lot of fat that I'm going to refinance out. So those guys over at Finny Mortgage are going to help me out with that. Stay tuned. It's going to be a good episode. And to Paul said, this is a game of finance right now. Get your finance sorted if you want to capitalize on this market. Paul, thanks for your time today.
Mate, you're more than welcome. Thanks for having me, buddy. And if I must indulge just a little bit, we're hopefully for the month of March at Pure Property, we're going to be trying to do everything we can to try and support some of these flood victims. So there's a great organisation called giveit.org.au. If anyone's sort of wondering how they can help out with any of these flood affected areas or people individually, giveit.org. They don't take any administration fees or anything to that effect. So you can essentially give money, you can give your time, or you can give specific products. But if anyone's thinking about how they can help it out, go and jump on their website, because they're a super practical way to assist people who are directly in need.
Yeah, and there's some people doing it tough right now, I'll tell you that. So our thoughts are with you. That's Paul Glossop, Pure Property Investment. Lots of other Paul podcasts. He's a semi-regular guest on the Smart Property Investment Show. Go and check it out. He normally speaks sense, sometimes otherwise. Our last podcast, Paul, I think we drew analogies between cricket and property investing. And
oh, geez, there hasn't been there some water under the bridge in the cricket space in the last couple of weeks.
Literally water under the bridge, but
oh, gee, yeah.
But anyway, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Please keep those reviews coming. I know Paul's team hasn't done it. I expect them to. Those reviews on whichever podcast player they listen to it, most of them Apple, social media, Smart Property HQ is where you find us. We'll see you next time. Till then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Looking to secure finance to maximize your returns on your investment property? Finny can help. With access to over 70 lenders, Finny can find the right finance for your unique situation. So whether you're ready to refinance for a better rate, improve your cash flow, release equity to grow your portfolio, or are looking to find the right finance for your next purchase, we're here to help. Visit finny.com.au today to learn more.